We're going to introduce you now to our keynote speaker of the day, who's Professor Robert Temple. Now, he's the author of a large amount of books on ancient history, ancient mysteries, and essentially the mysteries of time and space. I could quote various titles, Egyptian Dawn, the Sphinx Mystery, Crystal Sun, but he is most well known for a book called The Sirius Mystery, the book obviously that you can see up here. And the important thing about this book, which obviously Robert is about to tell you about, is that this seriously influenced a lot of people. I mean, it seriously influenced me in my younger years when I was a UFO investigator. It taught me for the first time about the idea of cosmology and the importance of the universe and the cosmos into ancient civilizations and what we do down here on Earth. But it also introduced us to the Dogon people of Mali and their incredible cosmology that they have, and how this may well be something that's inherent from ancient Egypt and from Sumeria, and that all of these things perhaps, just perhaps, suggest that there may have been some kind of extraterrestrial connection with our ancestors. It influenced me, it influenced people like Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock and many other of my contemporaries in this field to get out and do things yourself and to write books. So, without further ado, I'm now going to introduce you to the author of that work, Professor Robert Temple.
Could you put that? Hello. Welcome, fellow conspirators. Shall we be naughty and talk about forbidden things? I thought that I'd start by telling you how I got into all this. It seems incredible, looking back, that I was actually what I thought was then very old, 20, when I stumbled across this information. And I was busy at the time, so it was a couple of years before I actually began having the opportunity to look into it. I'll just tell you how I stumbled across it. I was a student at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and I had an older friend called Arthur Young, who was a philosopher and inventor, and a very wealthy man with several houses, and his hobby was collecting Rolls Royces. True, I named one of them, actually. And I went round to him one day when I was 20, and he was sitting reading a book. I said, what's that book you're reading, Arthur? He said, oh, it's very interesting. It's a book called African Worlds, and I can learn about a whole lot of African tribes in one book because each chapter is about a different tribe. So I said, well, are any of the tribes particularly interesting? And he said, well, yes, 3 or 4 of them are very interesting, but there's one in particular that's more than interesting. It's very strange. And he showed me the chapter, which he had just finished, and he said, look, they seem to be called the Dogon tribe. And they were in a country which neither he nor I had ever heard of, called Mali. And it also said they were in the French Sudan, and of course I didn't know where the French Sudan was, and I don't think any of you would either, because it hasn't existed for a very long time. I'd heard of the Sudan, but the French Sudan, which is an old name from the old colonial days, was 2,000 miles away, and what it referred to, of course, was really French West Africa. And so he said, look at this page here. It says here, and I looked at it, that this tribe's culture and religion are entirely based upon the star Sirius. I said, the star Sirius? You mean not the sun or the moon or even Venus? Because I knew that Venus had been important to the Maya, for instance, because I'd already studied the Maya. And he said, no, nothing normal like that. But it gets worse because it's not just the star Sirius that they're really talking about. They say there's a star that goes around Sirius. I said, well, and I had done my introductory astronomy when I was earlier at the university. So I said, Arthur, I think there is a star that goes around Sirius. I seem to recall that. It's what they call a binary star system. And I know in the book I said that Arthur knew this, but I don't think he really did. So I said, I'm going to check this out, look in my old astronomy book, which I later did, and I contacted him and I said, it's true, there is a little star that goes around Sirius. And they knew its orbital period. Well, this just all sounded too bizarre to me, but as I say, I was 22 before I got around to doing anything about it, and by that time I was living here in England, in fact in London, and had already met Olivia, and I had befriended a man called Arthur C. Clarke, who was a well-known science fiction writer, and I'd spent a couple of years, I was still spending time watching a man called Stanley Kubrick, whom you've all heard of course, make a film called 2001, A Space Odyssey. I took Olivia out to the set. She was the first woman on the moon. Now, you remember that. I want that in the history books. Because it was all a plaster moon, you see. And so I had been reading Arthur's essays, which are even more amazing than his fiction, and got all spaced up, not spaced out. And so I remembered this tribe, and I wrote a letter to Arthur in America, and I said, Arthur, can you remember the name of that tribe you told me about a couple of years ago that they had the culture based on the star Sirius and a star that went around it? And he still had the book because he had a huge library. He got it out, and he photocopied the chapter for me and sent it to me. And so then I knew that they were called what I still thought was the Dogon, and I had some names and of the authors of the article. So I went along to the Royal Anthropological Society, which had a huge library at that time, and only a few years later it closed down. Everything was dispersed, so that wonderful facility disappeared, but I was in time. And I went to those wooden cabinets with the drawers you pull out with the all the very heavily thumbed cardboard library cards that younger people here won't remember, but older people will. And there are all these articles by these two French people who had written about the Dogon, who I still thought were the Dogon. And I was set right by the librarian that you should say Dogon. And I was just baffled because there was just too much material, and it was all in French, and I couldn't read French, so this is a bit of a problem. And I came across one article that had the name of Sirius in the title, so I thought, well, maybe I can learn something from that. So I got it out and photocopied it and took it away. Couldn't read it, but managed to get a little bit out of it. Olivia had studied French, so she helped. But the thing is that what I really needed was a good translation of it, and Olivia knew somebody who knew somebody, and for what was then the enormous sum of £5, and I thought maybe I'm crazy to be doing this. I got this guy who said he knew French to translate it, and it's the most terrible translation, absolutely appalling, full of errors of every kind, as I later discovered. But it was enough to get me going with a lot of leads to start getting to grips with the material. And that's how it all started. Just one of those things. I went to see this friend at a particular time of day, on a particular day, and he just happened to be reading that book, sitting in his armchair, and I walked in. And that's why I'm here now. And that was a very long time ago. Although I'm not that much over 22, am I? So that's what started it. And I thought, because I'd written some articles, I thought, I have to write an article about this really strange subject. And I wrote an article, and I took it round, and nobody would believe it. They said, you must be joking. Well, they just wouldn't believe it. So you need more evidence. So I wrote a longer article. And they wouldn't believe that one either. And so then I did an even longer one with much more information. And nope, they still didn't believe it. So I decided that the only way to get this increasingly interesting story across to the public was I was just going to have to write a book about it, which had by no means been my intention. But that's how it ended up. And it took me a few years to do that, and it turned into the first edition of the Sirius Mystery. I managed to get an agent who lived nearby, and he offered it to a publisher, and the publisher took it, and they gave me an advance of £250 for this book, and they sat on it for 3 years, and because they didn't think it was anything very important, and so great frustrations. It finally came out, and then nobody was more surprised than the publisher when, on the day of publication, the Times and the Telegraph both ran rave lead reviews of this book, which had never happened before for such a weird book as that. And then it continued to get all these favorable reviews. In fact, the only newspaper in the country, or in America, or indeed anywhere for the first year, who said anything even remotely critical about the book was the Daily Worker. I had my suspicions about that. Because I was a worker, I'd worked really hard to write that thing. So it was getting embarrassing at all the praise, you see. Nature magazine, which is for scientists, they did a lead review done by a professor of astronomy from Canada, and all these people were praising it, and the man who was the president of the Royal Astronomical Society, who sponsored me to become a fellow, he was praising it and telling everybody that it was a good book, and yet I was writing about spacemen. So this was breakthrough time. And of course, people would ask me about UFOs, and I would say, well, I don't know anything about UFOs any more than you do. So that made them feel better, because I wasn't going to be pushing that subject. And it is a book which is full of footnotes, and so everything went well for the first year, and it took off, and it was translated and was what they call an international bestseller. And then in 1977, because the book came out in 76, I started being attacked systematically by a group of people who were all linked with one another, and it became obvious later on that the security services, primarily the CIA, were behind all of this. I know this because people approached me and told me that the CIA people had been contacting them. And Arthur Clarke phoned me up from Ceylon, it's now called Sri Lanka, to warn me that this was going on. And a friend of mine who was engaged to the girl next door, who was a policeman, said to me that he'd been approached by MI5 and that he had to do a big report on me. And he said, what's all this? Robert Temple, he's completely harmless. What do you want me to do a report on him for? He had to interview everybody who knew me. He had to write a long report, everything they could find out about me. And he said, Robert, I just want to let you know that I told them what a great guy you are. And the whole thing was ridiculous, but they wouldn't listen. And they were dissatisfied, and they looked unhappy that I gave you a good reference. He later became a police commissioner. He was a very bright guy. And then I was friends with a chap called Brigadier Bidwell, a retired soldier who was a military historian, and we were having tea, and he said he'd read my book, The Sirius Mystery. I said, Brigadier Bidwell, The Sirius Mystery, that is very far from your sphere of interest. Why on earth would you read that kind of book? He said, well, I didn't want to. They asked me to. They told me I had to. I said, who are they? Well, I was approached, you see, he said, because they knew that I knew you, and they said, you've got to read this book and do a report on the book and a report on Temple, and this was for MI6. And so then the CIA went around telling people they shouldn't speak to me, they shouldn't work with me. It just went on for years, and some of that is still going on. Now, it was only later that I realized that to the security people, extraterrestrial life is what they call the ultimate security issue. You see, if the spacemen, or women, space persons, if the space persons should be hostile, and of course this is true, actually. I mean, looking at it from their point of view, this is true. This would be the ultimate security issue because we might all die. But of course, we're being told every day we are going to all die. It's Ebola now. It used to be SARS. It was AIDS. It was bird flu. It's always something. We're all going to die, as if we didn't know that. So there's been certain problems along the way. Now, I'm going to run you through this Sirius mystery, basic information, and I think you'll find some of the pictures pretty. And I will say that in the 1980s, a prediction which appeared in the book was verified by astrophysicists. They verified the existence of a third star in the Sirius system, which the tribe, as I will explain in a moment, insisted existed, and it was the same type of star. So, armed with this verification of what I had published before this was known, I was asked to bring the book out again. And I decided, well, I don't want to just do a reprint, I want to expand it. So I expanded it by 50%, and that came out in 1998, and that's the edition that you should all read if you think you can face it, because it's longer, but it's got a lot of interesting stuff in it. And of course, since 1998, a lot more has come along, but I'm afraid I'm not going to do the third version. But I'm now going to, I was going to. We need Andrew's secret password, which I think is something like... By the way, it was the publishers who put Akhenaten on the cover. He's only mentioned in passing briefly in the book, and he doesn't really figure in the story. But after seeing all those deformed skulls, I think it's time to move on. Now, the big star is Sirius, and the images that go off to the right and to the left are multiple sort of refraction images. This was the very first photo taken of Sirius B in 1970. Sirius B is the little dot down to the right. There is, in fact, a red thing on this. Now, Sirius A, which is the name of the main star, is 3.5 times the mass of our sun and 10,000 times brighter. And it's a really big star, kind of a cosmic bully. And it's got this little tiny star that goes around it, which was detected because of gravitational interference. And Sirius B is what they call a white dwarf. And it was the very first one of those discovered. We've now found many, and they're believed to be very common throughout the universe. Sirius B is about the size of our sun. And it's so much smaller than the little star, than the big star, that it's almost impossible because of the brightness of the main star, due to parallax and that they're being so near, to tease the light away so that you can reveal the tiny star behind it, which is what the astronomer who took this photograph managed to do. And I knew him. He was at the U.S. Naval Observatory, Irving Lindenblad, very nice man. And I went and looked through his telescope, and he showed me Sirius B, and I was thrilled. This is later on. And so 1970 was the very first time anybody had succeeded in taking a photograph of Sirius B. They knew it was there because of all the gravitational things. But why would it interfere gravitationally with a giant star like Sirius A when it's so small? And this is the whole nature of white dwarfs, that they're made of a special kind of matter that doesn't exist in our solar system, called superdense matter. And what that is that the electrons are stripped off the atoms and the nuclei are pressed together directly, so that if you had a matchbox full of superdense matter, it would weigh 2.5 tons. And as we will see later, the fact that this was known on this planet, before it was known on this planet, if you see what I mean, is the serious mystery. Now, it turned out that all of this was known by the Dogon tribe, and I thought you'd like to see where they are in Africa. That's in the country of Mali. You can see Timbuktu is above, although they don't ever go that far north. And I'm going to show you now some pretty pictures of where they live. I should say that they have related tribes around them. The Bambara, the Bozo, the Minyanka are their cousins and neighbors. All of them have the Sirius traditions, and all of them have their religion and culture based on Sirius. They are also related to the Akan of Ghana, who went a bit further than they did in the migrations, which I'll describe in a moment. So this shows where they live, and that cliff is called the Bondi Agora cliff. It's 1,000 feet high. It's full of caves, lots of burials, and all kinds of strange graffiti. Sacred graffiti, I hasten to add. Not Kilroy was here. And you see, they live in this fascinating area. They grow onions for a living. And yet they know a lot about astrophysics, so figure that one out. Here's a close-up of the cliff. Now you can see at the bottom what looks like rubble. That's not rubble, that's their houses, which are made of sort of mud brick type stuff, but not brick, it's adobe type thing. And their houses are along the base of the cliff there. They live in those. That's another view of the rocks leading up to the cliff with the houses beyond. And this is a sacred rock nearby where they stage certain ceremonies. And here's another shot of their houses looking down on them. It's a strange and rather surreal landscape, don't you think? And they have these baobab trees, and they feature in their mythology. Everything that they consider dear is expressed symbolically in terms of the fauna and flora around them. It's very like the way the ancient Egyptians based their writing system of hieroglyphics upon the flora and fauna around them. Every bird and every animal that you see in the hieroglyphics of the ancient Egyptians lived in Egypt and was familiar to everyone. And this same kind of approach towards embodying and bringing nature into their sacred traditions was something that the Dogon have always done, and their fellows in the neighboring tribes. Here's another view. I think we may have seen that one already. Now, this one shows a very interesting ceremony taking place called the Cygwi, which is to do with the celebration of Sirius, and it's held every 60 years. This was in 1963. And you can see that they're getting dressed and ready for the big procession. This is a huge ceremony. It takes place in every village throughout the whole area. They go around to all the villages, and hundreds of thousands of people take part in this and dress up for it. It's their biggest event. Now, there's a Dogon putting his feet up, as it were. You can see these sacred symbols that are painted on the cliffs. Each one has a very profound meaning, and if you were to have a Dogon priest standing beside you looking at that cliff face, he could take several hours to explain to you the meaning of each one of those symbols. They are really very profound, and I should tell you that the Dogon have thousands of standardized symbols which are a kind of writing, but I've never come across a study as to whether they're actually writing language using them as signs, or whether they are purely symbolic. That's obscure to me, and I don't think the anthropologists ever figured it out either, because the Dogon didn't tell them everything by any means. So here's another view of the base of the cliff. This is a man from the Bozo tribe. They live on the banks of the Niger River, or some people say Niger, and they are fishermen. So the Dogon are farmers, and the Bozo are fishermen, and they have their religion and culture based on Sirius as well, as I said, and they have a name for Sirius. They call it the Eye Star, and the companion of Sirius they call Sitting Trouser. This actually has relevance when we get further down the line. But the Bozo are more frequently encountered by outsiders because they're on the river. Here's another shot of preparing for the ceremony. Now, those things that they're putting on their bodies are symbolic of fish scales, and the hats are symbolic of fish heads, not unlike bishops' mitres. And it won't be long before you see why they're so keen on fish. This is just another pretty picture of a baobab tree growing in the rocks. There's another view of the cliff. And what they do, you can't get up it from the bottom. You have to go up to the top and dangle on ropes. And as I say, it's a 1,000-foot cliff. And to get into those caves that you see along there, they're all full of sacred objects and burials, mummified burials, and sacred symbols on the walls. It's an immense complex. It's never been fully explored because, you see, you have to go down 1,000 feet on a rope and sort of swing in, and not a lot of people really fancy doing that. Here they are in procession now for the Cygwin Ceremony. And here they are from behind doing the same. These photos were taken by a very remarkable Greek man called Costa, whom I knew. He was a very close friend of the anthropologists and had worked with them for a long time, for years. He couldn't stay away from Mali. Apparently, Mali gets in your blood and you can't stop going back. It's a bit like people who, like myself, who get hooked on Egypt. You can't stop going back. And this is a slightly closer view of the strange houses that they live in. This is a photograph of a mass gathering after the procession. They congregate in these large gatherings for the big ceremony. They have a similar ceremony once a year called the Bado Day, B-A-D-O. It's to celebrate the Bado rite. It's one day a year because they say that, and I'll come to more about the astronomy in a moment, that Sirius B sends out a very powerful ray. They say Sirius B spins on its axis once a year, and once a year this beam strikes the Earth and makes everybody go wild. And they celebrate this by the Bado Day ceremony, which is not quite as grand as this one, but they're very keen on ceremonies. But then so is the Archbishop of Canterbury. I don't hold that against you. So you see, and this is a wider view of how important this ceremony is. Everybody takes part in it. It's their major religious ceremony. This is a really amazing man who I never met, Marcel Griol. He died in 1955, and he was one of the two anthropologists who recorded all this information of the Dogon tribe, along with the woman I'll show you next. And I did meet her. Now, Griot was so remarkable that he gained the confidence of these people. And when he died, his funeral was held in Mali. 250,000 tribesmen journeyed by foot to attend his funeral, to honor him. How many of us are going to have 250,000 people at our funeral? I'm afraid Westminster Abbey, not enough. In fact, what Western potentate or leader, I was in Washington on the day of Kennedy's funeral, there weren't even 250,000 people in Washington that day. Just imagine that vast concourse of people coming to honor this man. That's why he managed to get this information out of them, because you see, the Dogon have different levels of initiation, and he talked to the head priests. You'll see them in a moment. Now, this is his collaborator, Germaine Dieterlen. She was a true grande dame, and she was very nice, but very haughty, and, as many French academics are. I went to see her in her very large flat in Rue de Grenelle in Paris, 7e. And she lived in quite a grand style, wasn't she, when she wasn't sleeping in a tent in Africa. And I tried to find more about the Sirius material from her, and she said, "Oh, but there's so much. When can I have time? There's so much. Look, you see there?" And I looked at the far end of this big room through a door. There was light coming through from the window on the far side, and there was a desk there with a great big pile of books like this, notebooks. She said, "Those are my notebooks that I haven't transcribed yet. I have to transcribe them, then I have to edit them, then I have to publish them. There's too much material. There's so much more in there about the Sirius traditions." Alas, she told me this when she was pretty old, and there's a lot more about all this that's never been published. I can only presume that she left the notebooks to the Musée de l'Homme, where she was based. I'm including this photo of Dieterlen, who is in the middle in Africa, because the woman to the right of her, that's on her left, but you are right, was a wonderful woman whom I also knew, an anthropologist called Solange de Gonnet. And she found that Dieterlen was so much of a prima donna that she had to change tribes because it just wasn't working out. So Solange went and did the Bambara, along with her friend Dominique Zahn. And so those are the personalities who gathered the information. Now for the priests. This one's called Manda, and he likes jewelry. He spoke a different language from the other three Dogon ones, called Wazuba, and he came from a place called Mande. But he's very sharp and very meticulous about detail, and was a very excellent informant. And this is Yebeni, and this was the most important one of all. She's a woman, not taking a great deal of care about her appearance. Her name was Inekuzu, and she was the high priestess of Amma. The chief god of the Dogon, and they are monotheistic, is called Amma, A-M-M-A. And as I was later to figure out, when I found out where the ancestors of this tribe really came from, it's the same as the god Amun of the Egyptians. She was the one who knew more than the three male priests, because she was a higher level of initiation. And this one is called Onyonlu. He was the most helpful in terms of giving the longest interviews, and he corrected various details and so on. So these are the people who gave the information to the anthropologists, and I thought it's important for you to see the priests involved and the anthropologists involved for yourselves, to see their faces and to hear a few words about them from me, so that you can see where all this information is coming from and how it came to be recorded. And bearing in mind that the anthropologist who had 250,000 people come to his funeral was a very special man who was able to get things out of these African priests that nobody else could have done. So now we come to the Dogon evidence. You're going to see a number of pictures with this kind of tan background. That's because these are reproductions of sand drawings. All the drawings and diagrams which appear in the anthropological reports are drawings made by Dieterlen, copying sand drawings done by the Dogon on the ground in front of her. In a few cases colored, as in this case. Now the red disk is the sun, our sun. And the white thing with the 4 rays coming out of it is Sirius. That's the main star of Sirius. This represents the heliacal rising of Sirius, which happens once a year, and was New Year's Day for them, because they have several calendars, but their main sacred calendar is a Sirius calendar. And the heliacal rising, Helios was the Greek name for the sun. So what we say when we talk about a star and the sun rising at the same time, we call it a heliacal rising. And the next day, the star would have moved forward and moved forward. It's only one day a year when you get them at the same moment. And this is the Dogon sand drawing depiction of the moment that commences New Year's Day and their sacred year. Which I should say that the ancient Egyptians had the same thing. First day of the year was the heliacal rising of Sirius, and the Sirius calendar was how they measured time. And it's not a coincidence. Now, I'm showing you this picture that may look very uninteresting, as if it's just grasses. And in a way, it is, I suppose, just grasses. It's of a plant that makes a very small seed, and it's called fonio, and it only grows in West Africa. It's a staple food there. And the Dogon call it by the name of po, and its Latin name, which is used by the anthropologists, is digitaria. And you have to have an awful lot of seeds to have a bowl full of anything to eat. But it is used symbolically by the Dogon because it is the smallest seed anybody's ever seen anywhere in the world that you could possibly eat. It's much smaller than a poppy seed or a sesame seed. And so they use it to symbolize Sirius B because they're both so small. And so Sirius B is known to them as the Po star, named after this cereal grain. And I went to a great deal of trouble to find a botanical illustration of this, which in my first edition I didn't have, because I thought people would like to see this grain. So now we come to geometry, and I'm sure you all know that this is an ellipse. This is an ellipse, as Monty Python might say. And so on the left is a circle with one center, and on the right is an ellipse which has not one center but two centers, and they're called foci, which seems a bit strange, but that's how it works. And this is known by the Dogon, as you'll see. In the 16th century, Johannes Kepler discovered his law of planetary motion, which said that the planets go around the sun, not in circles, as everybody had imagined until then, but in ellipses, elliptical orbits, and that the sun is at one focus of the ellipse. Of course, a lot of people got really upset about that. But then a lot of people are always getting upset when anybody says anything new. At least he wasn't killed, like Giordano Bruno in 1600 was burnt at the stake for saying there was life on more than one world, Those were dangerous times, almost as bad as today. How did the Dogon know that there were elliptical orbits in space? Well, here's a sand drawing that they drew. The star Sirius has got the S underneath. It's the I better use this red light. It's a very small, feeble red light, but I hope you can make it out. On the right there, what looks like a bow and arrow, that's the star Sirius, which is meant to be more or less at a focus of this egg-shaped or elliptical orbit. And at the top, you see D2, S2, it is in this diagram, S2 at the top and the bottom. Those show this is a drawing of the orbit of Sirius B around Sirius, and those are the two furthest points. So it's shown twice. And then the thing in the middle is Sirius C, as astronomers call it. That's the third star, which is in fact a red dwarf. It's small, but it's not a white dwarf. It doesn't have the super powerful gravitation. And the Dogon maintained that the that there are living beings on a planet that goes around that third star. So now I'm comparing a modern astronomical diagram of the orbit of Sirius B around Sirius with the travel diagram, which is on the left. And as you can see, there's a very uncanny similarity. And we're talking about a tribe that grows onions for a living. They do not have any scientific instruments. You can only see Sirius B with a 15-inch telescope if you're very lucky and it's at the right part of its orbit. And of course the Dogon had no telescopes. Not only could they not see it, but they admitted that they had never seen it and could not see it. They said that to the anthropologists. We can't see it, but we know it's there. And so the next question is, well, how do you know it's there? We'll come to that. Here's a linear extension of the orbit, the two orbits that I've just compared. And here's a rather early but a typical astronomical computation of stable orbits that could exist around a binary star system, A and B being two stars. And these orbits that you see around them have been computed to be stable so that you can have other bodies orbiting around, as indeed the Dogon insist that there are in the Sirius system. I should say that the Sirius system is 8.7 light years away from us, and it's therefore a very nearby star system. And I'll have more to say about that too in a moment. But here's another Dogon diagram. Now, S for Sirius, and the D on both sides stands for Digitario. Remember that the anthropologists use the Latin name to stand for the Sirius B star. So there are the two positions, and at the furthest position on the right, they say that its light shines coherently when it's near Sirius, but when it gets further away, it's speckled or scintillating, or it looks like it might be several points of light. It changes its brightness considerably as it goes further away in its orbit. I don't quite understand that, but that's what they say. Interesting detail. Now here's another sand drawing, and I hope you can make it out because it's a bit faint, but I'll stop kicking that microphone. So we have here the orbit of Sirius B. Sirius A is in the middle there, and you've got this elliptical orbit going around it. And then up to the top right-hand corner is another orbit that is a planet that's going around the third star, which also travels along with Sirius B. In other words, the planet orbits Sirius C. The Dogons say that two planets orbit Sirius C, but only one of them is inhabited. The diagrams can be symbolic rather than diagrammatic. This one is symbolic. It's not meant to be showing any configurations in space. So the S is, once again, clearly for Sirius. The F is meant to be suggesting the orbit around it of Sirius B, but they don't bother to draw it all the way because they're not doing a pictorial representation in this case. And it's also the orbit of the other star. And down at the bottom is a C. As if there weren't enough stars, the Dogon, in a rather offhand manner, almost flippantly say, well, there's another one, fourth star, and they call it the goat herd, and it has a retrograde orbit, which is why it's going off in that direction. It goes the opposite way around all of the others, and they say that it's as far from Sirius B as Sirius B is from Sirius A. But it's not very interesting, because nobody lives there, and it doesn't really figure in their mythology very much, or at least not that part of their traditions that they chose to reveal. So we've got a Sirius D as well, according to the Dogon. And so the number of cosmic bodies in the Sirius system, according to the Dogon, are Sirius A, the big star, Sirius B, the white dwarf, Sirius C, the red dwarf, and the goat herd, which is some kind of ordinary star, but clearly not as big as Sirius A, and then two planets that go around Sirius C, one of which has creatures on it. I hesitate to say people, and you'll soon see why. This is a very strange drawing. S once again for Sirius. This doesn't refer to outer space at all. This refers to the very weird connection that the Dogon conceive of between circumcision, yes, and celestial motions. You see, all Dogon men have to be circumcised because the knife going around in a circle represents the cosmic orbit of Sirius B. They claim that Sirius B is the source of all living things, that without it, nothing else in this part of the space would exist, that it is what emitted and generated everything. And therefore, it's really Sirius B that they're honoring. Sirius A is a bit of a bother. They say that Sirius A is an unruly star, and the Sirius B keeps it under control. And in fact, Sirius B gives its instructions to Sirius A by means of Sirius C. It passes its messages on to Sirius C, and Sirius C communicates with Sirius A and tells it to behave itself. This is what the Dogon are saying. And so A and B represent the different parts of sort of certain elements of the anatomy of a delicate nature. And you'd be amazed how much sexual symbolism is fundamental to all their religious traditions. Now, here we have another one of these diagrams, and here we have Sirius C with the elliptical orbit around it of its inhabited planet. Sirius C has a cross, and in the middle to identify it, and the dots represent whatever they represent. It's not entirely clear, but they say that when we die, we all go back to Sirius C. That's where souls go and where they come from. The souls are all originally emitted by Sirius B, but they're deposited at Sirius C, and Sirius C takes care of the business. It's like the business manager for Sirius B. And so the male souls go around on the outside, and the female souls go around on the inside. There's a segregation of gender as when you die, or at least on your final destination. And so this star, Sirius C, is known as the female sorghum. Sorghum is another grain. You may have heard of it, and which they eat all the time. So they use cereals and vegetables and all these kind of things to represent things. So the Sirius C is represented by the grain sorghum, and it's called female sorghum, and it's a female star, and its planet is called the planet of women. Absolutely adamant that females dominate everything at this system. And men are sort of tolerated. Well, we all know about that. And we did see that the chief priest was a priestess. This is another one of these sexual drawings. S for Sirius, D for Sirius B, Digitaria, and E is meant to be a penis, and B and B prime are both representing the foreskin, and A represents a knife, and T represents another point along the orbit of the Sirius B star. This gets increasingly weird, really. When you get into all the Dogon stuff, you feel you're just drowning. It's so detailed and complicated. This is a picture of Sirius B close up, showing all the seeds inside, from which everything has come, and seeds being ejected in different ways, different types of seeds in different ways, different seeds that do different things. Everything that is in this part of space comes from this white dwarf. That's what they say, and continues to do so. They also know other strange things about things that you can't see. This is a picture of Saturn with a ring around it. In other words, they knew about the rings of Saturn, which you can only see with a telescope. And this is a picture of Jupiter with its 4 main moons, which you can only see with a telescope. Now, the Dogon have known these things for many hundreds of years because the anthropologists, who, by the way, were not astronomers, and when I met Germaine Dieterlen, she barely knew the difference between a star and a planet. I mean, she just knew nothing about astronomy. They were just writing down what they were told, and they could sense that there was something pretty strange about this, but they didn't really want to call attention to it because they were worried about being criticized by fellow anthropologists. And you know what academics are like. If they stray from the beaten path and talk about anything slightly strange, they can easily be ostracized, lose their posts, their careers could end, nobody will speak to them. I hardly need to remind you. And so Griel and Dieterlen were well aware of the dangers to their careers if they called attention to all this weird astronomical stuff, so they buried it in this Anthropological journal in about 1950 and never spoke of it again until I turned up. And Germaine Dieterlen was very, 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 very loath to talk to me about it. But then she got so old she was officially retired, so she wasn't in any actual danger anymore to admit that she'd recorded all this weird stuff from an African tribe that happened to be advanced astrophysical knowledge that it was impossible for them to possess. Or at least it appears that it was impossible for them to possess, but they did possess it. But Griel and Dieterlen went to a lot of trouble to find evidence of how far back did all this go. And they found evidence going back as physical evidence for Cygwin ceremonies and all this kind of thing, going back to the 12th century. And from the anthropological studies of their migration routes and all that sort of thing, it's known that they came down from the northeast through the Sahara, through the Fezzan oasis, and finally settled at Mali about 900 to 1,000 years ago. Before that, they had come, as I managed to work out with Eva Meyerowitz, a British anthropologist, whose main concern was the Akan tribe, who preserved many, many Egyptian traits, that all these peoples who are related to one another in West Africa that I've mentioned, they're all descended from the ancient Egyptians by way of Libya over many, many centuries. I mean, the migrations are recorded even in Herodotus. It was going on that long ago. And I made the first map that anybody had ever made of the locations of the different Libyan tribes according to Herodotus, and then plotted it all out and studied the names, and 2 of them have names named after Amma and so on. And you can see exactly how they migrated west and west and west and then south down through the oasis and ended up in Africa, intermarried with the local black tribes, which is why they have very black skins, and they adopted African language, but they kept a lot of loan words. Here we have a picture of Sirius B on the left and Sirius C on the right, side by side. Sirius B is rather anally retentive of its rays. Sirius C is very expensive personality, wants to get his rays out there. And these are not strictly accurate because the Dogon do maintain that Sirius C is oval as well. It's not purely round, but here for purposes of contrast, they have shown it as round. So now we come beyond the stars to how they say they discovered all their information. Because they realized that Sirius B is made of superdense matter. They said that it's made of a matter which is a metal called sagala, from their word sakatara, which means strength. So it's a strong metal, and they describe it as best they can. They said all the people in the world could not lift it. It's so heavy. And they have all sorts of wonderfully complex numerical calculations. I mean, you wouldn't believe how complicated it all gets. And one of their favorite numbers is 480, which sort of symbolically represents the highest number to them in the same way that 10,000 used to do traditionally for the Chinese. The Chinese know perfectly well that it's not literally 10,000, and they say, oh, 10,000 things, but what they mean is an infinite number. And similarly, the Dogon use 480 sometimes. And they said, it's heavier than 480 ass loads. You see how quaint their pictorial symbolism is. But what they're saying is, quite specifically, they state that this material does not exist on Earth. They know the difference between solar systems and empty space. They say that our sun and our planet and Jupiter and Venus and whatever are in one system. Then there's a big, long, empty space. And finally, you come to another bunch of suns and planets, and that is the Sirius system. And they know this, and they've known it for centuries. And they know about superdense matter, which we only discovered in 1926 when Sir Arthur Eddington, one of my scientific heroes, realized that it was the only way to explain the gravitational influence of Sirius B, this tiny star, on Sirius A. And now we know that's all true. But the anthropologists began to go to the Dogon in 1931, and they certainly didn't know nuclear physics, and they didn't know astronomy, and there was no contamination. People say, well, what about the White Fathers who were the missionaries of the French in that part of the world? No, I wrote to the head of the White Fathers, and he wrote back and he said, we had no missions to those people until, I think it was 1948, 49 was the first mission. And there was just no way that the Western knowledge could make it through there. And then, of course, they said Sirius C existed and described what type of star it was, and that was only demonstrated in the 1980s. So we've got a real mystery on our hands, and that's why I called the book The Sirius Mystery, and it has not been solved. And I'm not pushing a theory or an answer. I'm trying to tell everybody about the mystery. That's why the book is called a mystery, because it's genuinely what it is. So where did they get the information? They say that their ancestors, who did not live in Mali, but lived in their original homeland, wherever that was, were told it by visiting beings who came from that planet around Sirius C. And when they came down, the first thing that happened, a new star appeared in the sky. And they call that the star of the 10th moon, whatever that means. And it got brighter and brighter, and then stopped and stayed stationary. That's the first thing that happened. Of course, we would call that a mothership today. And then landing ship came down. That's what we would call it, which had fire coming out of it, out of its bottom. And it came down, and a lot of dust rose up. And this is a picture of the whirling of the dust, of the descent of this ship, which they call the Ark. Well, the anthropologists call it Arche in French, which means ark in English. Presumably, they are attempting to translate into French the equivalent of what they gathered that the Dogon word, whatever it was, meant. They call it the Ark. That's what the anthropologists always call it. So, no connection with Noah, one presumes. But here's another picture of the same whirling dust. So that they're really big on this whirling dust. They just never got over it. And then they said, and after it stopped, it was like a fire that went out. So it's a very detailed description of what seems to be the landing of a rocket-powered landing craft for these creatures. And then the creatures got out, and that's where the fun begins. But before I show you the creatures, I will tell you what the Dogons say about inhabited worlds. They claim that in our region of space, there are 6 inhabited planets. There's the Earth, which is the 4th one. On the 3rd one, there are the men with horns. On the 5th one, that's the one at Sirius, and we'll see them in a moment. And on the 6th planet, there are the men with wings. And this is a 400 6,000-year-old iron statue of one of the inhabitants of the 6th inhabited planet in our area of space. This shows one of the men with wings. And I think that if somebody told you that was by Giacometti, you'd believe it. And if that were in the Tate Modern, people would be raving about it. I consider this a great work of art. I mean, this is a very expressive iron statue of a man with wings. And now I will show you an equally old iron statue of the people from the 5th planet who they claim visited. That's the statue. They give very detailed anatomical descriptions of these beings who they claim had no... What really impressed them was they had no elbows. There were no joints in their arms. The Dogon just think this is so hilarious that these beings had no elbows. And also, they didn't have much in the way of teeth. And their teeth were very pointy, not like ours. And they go into great detail, and they breathed through their clavicles. Dolphins have sort of air holes, you know. But these were aquatic beings. So what they seem to be describing is something very similar to an amphibious mammal type of creature, or an amphibious reptile, amphibious in any case, breathing air, but they lived in the water. And we'll come to more of that. But as you can see, they're well equipped there with flipper hands to swim in the water. And obviously that's a head on the end there. Now, this is a much more serpentine view than later became common. I hope you can make out these sand drawings. They're rather faint on this screen in these circumstances. But this is one of the many drawings of the beings, and they call them the Nommos, N-O-M-M-O. And this is one of the Nommos. And you can see he doesn't have any elbows, and he's got these sort of slightly flappy arms. And they have, in fact, because they live in an area where there are lots of catfish in the Niger River, sort of transformed their stock image of the Nommo from the more serpentine one that you saw that was 400 years old to these more modern ones, which look increasingly like catfish, if only perhaps to get the message across. But they were definitely not fish. They breathed air. And there's another one. These are all different Nommos with different names, because there were 8 Nommos who came to Earth, and 2, the mother and father Nommo, remained behind. But there was this group of 8 Nommos who came, and Ogdoad. And there were some problems with the Nommos, because they had a rebel Nommo whom the Dogon call Ogo, and he's the troublemaker, and he's represented by the fox. They have a white fox in that part of Africa, and he's always going around making trouble, and he's the cause of all the evil and disorder in the world. So we've got basically the fallen angel legend present. There's another Nommo. These are probably almost invisible here. And here are 2 Nommos together. And so that's the end of the Dogon Nommo pictures. In fact, it's the end of the Dogon pictures. But they claim that when the Nommos came, they introduced people to advanced things like how to cultivate grain and how to have more productive and useful lives. And that they were sort of civilizers who came down to try to sort things out, get things going on the earth. And so they revere them, and they look upon them as messengers, messengers from Amma, who sent them. At least that's how they conceive of it. And they don't worship them as gods or anything of that kind. They only have one God, Amma, who's the great God of the universe, And they go into cosmological explanations of how everything was a big chaos, and then Amma generated things from himself. It's very like the Egyptian creation cosmologies. Now we're getting into Irving Finkel territory, because we have here an Assyrian fishman. And he's not just a mermaid either. And here is the stone carving of which that 19th century engraving was a drawing. You can see he's swimming in the sea. According to the Babylonians, the Sumerians and the Babylonians who succeeded them and the Assyrians who succeeded them, civilization on Earth was brought to us, we humans already being here, of course, by visitors who came from the sky, and they had fishtails. And they became the chief god to the Philistines, known as Dagon, D-A-G-O-N. Whether that's got any connection with Dogon, I couldn't say, but it's kind of an interesting coincidence. And you may have read, if you're highly religious, in the Bible about the idol of Dagon, and the Jews did not like that because they did not like idols. And the Philistines worshipped Dagon, and the Canaanites worshipped Dagon under the name of Baal. And we're talking about fish beings. You'll be surprised at how many fish beings you're about to see. And they had priests who dressed in fish outfits. Now you see they had scales on them, wearing fish scales and fish heads, just like the Dogon, but you'll see more graphic versions of that. And this is the only original drawing to survive in the British Library, from which all the engravings were made by Layard in his great 19th century reports on his discoveries of the ruins of Nineveh. This is from his book. You can see this is the broken bottom half of a gigantic statue of a fishman. Now, these were also described by Greek writers who were writing about Babylonian traditions, and they called them Oannes. That's the Greek name. So I'm going to run through several examples of these fishmen. These are from gems in the British Museum, as it says in the caption. These would be a Babylonian or Assyrian, and as you can see, one of them has a star there. Now, there are some very strange pottery figures, ceramic figures of fishmen. They're called apkalu in Babylonian, and they tended to be buried as ceremonial secret deposits in the foundations of the temples. And at one point, some temple was being excavated, I forget which one, and they found a whole family of apkalu sort of standing there under the earth, blessing the temple from below, as it were. And this is one of them. Here are two standing together. None of this was in the first edition of my book. I didn't know about them. And here's one who's lying down, a bit lazy, this one. He's being much more fish-like than the others because he's actually swimming like those carvings that you saw just a moment ago. Here's another standing one looking at us head-on. It's difficult to know whether these are meant to be accentuating the human face because they're really priests of Oannes, or real Oannes. And here, this one would be a priest on the left, greeting two real ones on the right. And I don't know, I suppose that's the tree of life or something, not quite sure. Nobody thoroughly understands the symbology of all these ancient cultures any more than they do that of the Dogon, really. And here's one where the priest is pointing towards a star, and as you can see, there's all kinds of things going on. The god, there's a crescent moon on the right, and then this god is being carried along in a procession, carried by these people. This is obviously a sacred procession with a Dogon priest, an Oannes priest following along behind. Here's another one. This is a photograph of a cylinder seal impression showing the priests with the fish gear hanging off them behind. So the Babylonians, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians were just doing this the whole time. All their religious ceremonies featured these fish creatures who they very clearly said had founded civilization. And this is recorded in various Greek historians. But I won't go into all those details, which you'll find in my book. It's too much to go into in this talk. And here we have an eye in heaven looking down and shedding its rays. Remember that the bozo called Sirius the eye star. And I don't know what this is really all about, what that strange gizmo is, but according to the caption, this is really a priest dressed as Dagon or Oannes, but it just goes on and on like this. Now this is a creature who really exists in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf and in Florida and all sorts of places, called the dugong. Once again, a rather similar name to Dagon and Dogon. People have written to me many times and said, is there any connection between all these names? And the fact is, I don't know. But this is an air-breathing sea mammal, which is the closest in appearance to the Dogon representations of the visiting Nommo. So they might have been something like that, assuming it's true. But and I'm not insisting that it's true, but the Dogon insists that it's true. And so, as they're right about so much, maybe we should listen to them. Now, we go into other cultures. This is the god Serapis, or Osiris, in late times in Alexandria, or in fact, I think this may be from Syria, but this is Hellenistic times. By that time, they were putting fishtails and serpent tails onto the Egyptian divinities, and here is the goddess Isis, as you've never seen her before. And it's very odd, but even odder still is this one, Isis and Serapis, which is a later name of Osiris, who were married to each other, with their entwined tails. Now, fix that image in your mind, because you're going to see it from quite another culture in a little while. Exactly the same motif. Really, really strange coincidence, but of course, clearly not a coincidence, as you'll see. Now, ancient Greece. This is Nereus, who preceded Poseidon, a very ancient Greek god. The Greeks maintained that civilization was brought by fishmen also. It's the Athenians who maintained this most strongly, because they said that Athens was founded by men with fish or serpent tails, and the founder was called Kekrops, K-E-K-R-O-P-S, but in English we Latinize it and say C-E-P-R-O-P-S. We can say Cecrops if it makes us feel better. We don't have to use the hard K of the Greeks. But the thing is, before the Athenians called themselves Athenians, they called themselves Kekropians. And then they decided to get really friendly with the goddess Athena, and in honor of her, they just started to call themselves Athenians. But before that, they were Kekropians. And they had one of these guys as their founder and first king. And I'm going to show you a picture of him in a moment. But before I do that, I'm going to show you this weird one. This is Scylla. You may have heard of Scylla and Charybdis from Homer's Odyssey. Charybdis was a whirlpool, and Scylla was a sort of siren who lived in a cave, and she used to eat passing sailors. And she was very dangerous. Now, this is a picture of Scylla, or Skula, as they would say in ancient Greek. And there she is, showing off her bust, and the top half of her is pretty much okay, but when you get down below the waist level, this is often the case, the things can change. And so here, at her waist, we have a protruding head of a dog. That's very important, because the dog symbolism is significant in that Sirius is traditionally known as the dog star. And I could tell you more about this, but there seem to be zoological possibilities of beings who have multiple heads. That's too strange to go into. So this is another one of the the sea god of the Greeks, but this one is, because it's to do with the Tyrrhenian Sea, he was probably called Tyrannos, the god or demigod of the Tyrrhenian Sea. But there he is with his dolphins playing with him, who are his pets, rather like we have dogs and cats. These guys had their dolphins as friendly pets. And here's another one. These pictures are never really discussed by archaeologists and classical scholars because, well, they simply don't know what to say. They just say, oh, well, it's the old man of the sea, or it's a merman. They don't quite know what to say about all of this, and it's just never discussed. And so most people who think they know a great deal about classical studies and Greek archaeology and whatever might never have set eyes on any of this, or if they had in passing, they would have thought it was some kind of artistic fancy. But it was far from that. And so this is a vase painting. On the right is Cecrops, the founder and first king of Athens. And what's going on is that in front of him is Athena, who has by this time been adopted by the Athenians. And the woman holding up the baby is Gaia, also known in ancient Greek as Ge, G-E, long E. And she wasn't. And she's holding up a baby called Erycthonios, who's going to become the next king in succession. And in many myths, Erycthonios himself is a fish or serpent-tailed being. Socrates was a stonemason by trade, you may recall if you've read any Plato. And he worked on the Acropolis carving something called the Erechtheum. As you go up in the Acropolis and you see the great big temple up there, up ahead at the end, slightly to the right. On the left is a structure, sort of rectangular structure with carved women draped in robes, looking very solemn, known as the Erechtheum. And that was built to honor Erycthonios, this little boy who's being brought to birth from the earth and handed by the earth goddess to Athena so that he can become the next king in succession to Cecrops here on the right. Now this became a standard motif in Greek vase painting. Here we have Zeus on the left with his thunderbolt waging war on the bad Nommo, the Ogo, known to the Greeks as Typhon. And as you can see, he was a nasty guy. And there was this heavenly war between the good gods and the bad gods. And so Typhon was subdued. And Zeus was able to reign peacefully from Mount Olympus, but there was still quite a lot of trouble. And of course, he was pretty naughty himself. Here again, we have the motif of Cecrops being handed his successor, delivered into the hands of Athena by the earth goddess, often symbolized because it's just her head and arms reaching up out of the earth, you see. And here's another version of the same, just to show you how popular this was. People would have one of these in their house. If they had a bit of money and wanted to show off to the neighbors, they'd have a scene of the birth of Erycthonios on a vase, prominently on display. And once again, the baby Erycthonios being handed to Athena. And this time on the left, we see Cecrops looking on at the birth of his successor. And this is a close-up of Cecrops, the first king of Athens. Now just think about this for a moment. We've got the Babylonians, Sumerians, and Assyrians saying that civilization was started by fishmen or serpent men, whichever. You have the Athenians saying that. And you have the Dogon of West Africa saying that. And now the Chinese also say that. Do you remember this motif of the Isis and Osiris with their entwined serpent tails from the Middle East? Here we have it in China. On the right is Fuxi, holding his carpenter's square because he measured the earth. On the left we find his wife, Nugua, and they are holding their little baby fishtail, their Erichthonius. Now, the Chinese maintain that Chinese civilization was founded by fish-tailed or serpent-tailed beings. The Chinese, the Greeks, the Sumerians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and the Dogon, it's getting too much. What is going on here? Why is it that we aren't all taught at school that ancient mythologies all over the world seem to exist, agree that civilization was brought to Earth by fish-tailed or serpent-tailed beings from the sky? And here's another rubbing. Now these carvings, of which these are rubbings from China, are 2,000 years old, from the Han Dynasty. Here we have lots of them. We've got the big ones with the entwined tails, as we saw with Isis and Osiris. We've got other ones leaping about. The guy on the right has his carpenter square again. That's Fu Xi. And there are many of these. In fact, and here is a little statue which I own, showing Fu Xi and Nugua entwined as one sort of dragon being, as it were. And I own this pair of rubbings, which are also Han Dynasty, which I collected in China, showing this is Nugua with a serpent rather than fishtail in this case, and this is, sorry, that was Fu Xi, and this is Nugua. They are holding, he's holding plants because he taught agriculture to men, you see, and she's holding agricultural implements. So I'm showing you all these fishmen from all over the world to impress upon you that the Dogon are in the mainstream. They may be pretty weird, but they've got a lot of company. The ancient Greeks, ancient people of the Middle East, the Chinese. How many more cultures do you want who are going to verify the antiquity of this fantastic idea? The civilization was brought to Earth by these fish-tailed or serpent-tailed semi-aquatic or aquatic beings who came from the sky. And here's another Greek vase I'm showing. This is the Chariot of the Rising Sun. I'm going to take you all the way around the vase because this is dawn arising. The sun is holding his horse's back. He's just about to rise. You can see his solar rays around his head. And here is the goddess of dawn on the right, Eos, chasing Orion away. This is the typical stance of Orion, always looking back with his arms at the angle of the three main stars, of what we call Orion's belt. And under his foot and just ahead of him is the dog for the dog star. That's Sirius. And here we see them coming around to the other side again. I have another one that I haven't included the picture of, which shows the constellation Lepus also in this scene. Here's the whole thing rolled out as one big picture. Now the Greeks were showing the heliacal rising of Sirius here. I showed you the Dogon picture of that. And here we have the Sumerian one. This is the heliacal rising of Sirius also. You see those two mounds? Those are the two mountains of dawn, and the sun god is rising between the two mountains of dawn, which are called the Mashu Mountains, which are symbolic because that's the eastern horizon. He's coming up between the two Mashu Mountains, and he has fire coming out of his arms and shoulders because he's the sun, you see. And he's looking at a star directly next to him. That is Sirius at the tip of an arrow, because to the Babylonians, the Sirius wasn't the dog star, it was the bow star. And so there's the bow down below, launching the arrow, of which Sirius is the tip, at the same moment as the sun is rising. And on either side of them are the two gates of dawn, which had been opened with the rampant lions on the top. And so this is the heliacal rising of Sirius, which is, once again, the first day of the year for the Egyptians and for the Dogon. So you see the commonality of these concepts across the whole world, really, apart from the Americas, stretching from China to West Africa. It's all the same. And it's as widespread as the Ark and flood legends that we heard about from Irving earlier. So they're all part of a complex. We're talking about a spread of traditions that's so wide, and yet the only coherent account we have of it all that survives is one that pieced together from the informants by the anthropologists and put into a systematic, modern format of explaining it point by point by point by point, which ancient peoples didn't tend to do. Aristotle was the first one to even attempt such a thing. And so we have a coherent account from the Dogon high priests, whereas we only have fragmentary things and hymns and wall texts and various papyri praising gods and whatever. They give you a bit of this and a bit of that. Plutarch attempted a systematic account of Isis and Osiris, but he was 1st century AD, and it was already the time when Rome was in control of Egypt, and it was pretty late stuff. I mean, Plutarch was the high priest of Delphi, and he was a serious scholar, but he couldn't get to the really ancient material because he couldn't read hieroglyphics. And he did his best. It's a wonderful, wonderful treatise on Isis and Osiris by Plutarch. If you haven't read it, you've missed something. Now here is my solution to interstellar contact. I call it the Interplanetary Bridge because I've patented this because I thought if we could just build a bridge between the worlds, or am I being too multicultural? This is my little joke. And this is my favorite portrait of myself before I lost all my hair. Don't worry, I never smoked a pipe. That's just for effect. It's a prop. I wanted to look scholarly and learned, and I thought maybe putting on a beret would help, but it just made it worse. So that is the end of the pictures, and I'm just going to tell you, I'll have to look at my watch to see where we stand in terms of time. Before I open up to questions, I just want to tell you a very strange thing. In the 4th to 5th centuries, there lived a man called Macrobius, a Greek author and scientist who wrote some wonderful books that are really fascinating. And in one of his books, he said that there was something called the sacred fraction. It was 253 over 246. And he said it comes from the ancients. This was repeated by Chalcidius, Gaudentius, Theon of Smyrna, and Proclus. Now I have an entire lengthy appendix about Proclus in the Sirius Mystery because he knew about invisible bodies in space, and I believe he knew all about the Sirius Mystery. He also mentions the sacred fraction. So I thought, I'm not at all sure about this sacred fraction. What's so special about 253 over 246? Because those numbers meant nothing to me. So I did a little bit of elementary arithmetic and discovered that it was equal to the decimal 1.053. So I thought, well, that's not familiar to me either. But I did a bit of research. I just had a hunch. I looked up in the standard astrophysical reference book called Astrophysical Data, which at that time had just come out, and discovered that the mass of Sirius B is 1.053 that of our sun. And I thought, sacred fraction, Sirius B compared to our sun, is this some kind of wild coincidence to 3 decimal points? And clearly I don't know, but it led me to think that there are, because since the last edition of the Sirius Mystery came out, I've realized much more about the structure of space. And I think that the Sirius system and our solar system may be part of a kind of cell in space. And I just want you to know that when you get cells of whatever size, absolute size, they can do something called developing long-range order. This happens with very simple things called Bénard cells on the surface of a fluid in a pan that's heated by thermal convection. You have a perfectly featureless surface of the fluid, and suddenly it forms these strange cells. And analysis by chemists has shown that long-range order appears within these cells, which is 10 million times the order that existed before the cell formed. And you seem to be able to get faster-than-light contact within cells, which you can't get outside cells. And so it's not impossible, and this is my speculation only, that the Sirius system and the solar system, being part of a cell, have a much more intimate connection than we imagine. But don't forget that the Dogon maintain that stuff is being beamed at us all the time from the Sirius system. Now that may sound folksy and just some tribal fantasy, but there may be something to this. I'm not at all sure that we don't have telepathic communication going on between the two systems at faster than the speed of light, what scientists would call tachyonic speeds. This may sound way out, but ever since the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen thing and the aspect experiment and all these physics experiments, which obviously I can't go into, which have demonstrated the possibilities of long-range order suddenly manifesting itself in what appear to be large systems but turn out to be cells. And once you're a cell, you're no longer large because you're just that cell. That we have to take very seriously the possibility that our solar system and the Sirius system may be intimately connected. I should add that the Dogon maintained that the Nommos left long time ago, but that they said they'd be back, and when they come back it will be called the Day of the Fish, and they will rule from the waters. And this brings us back once again to the ultimate security issue. Just to help you sleep better at nights. So, what about some questions? Hard to see you, but somebody's going to raise a hand.
Okay.
Andy, are you going to take over?
Yes, well, I'll just see if I can chair it for the moment. But if the house lights could go up at some point, then we can see the audience and see where we're going. But we can. We've also got a second mic, which we'll get sorted out. Oh, there's one there. Okay. Right, well, we'll realise that many of you have obviously got trains to catch and things like that. But we'll certainly have a few questions for Robert. Who would like to start off the proceedings? That lady there. It's not on. Okay. Well, look.
Thank you. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that the Dogon have a very important ceremony every 60 years. What's the significance of the 60 years? Do you know what that is?
You certainly asked a really good question, because the orbital period of Sirius B is 50 years. And so why they have a 60-year period is something that's puzzled a lot of people. It's called the Cygwin Ceremony, spelled S-I-G-U-I. And I proposed in one of my appendices of the book that it might be the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, which happens once every 60 years. And I gave many precedents for that. It's explained at some length. This is just an idea. We're not serious. It's also suggested by the anthropologists that they may have been attempting to disguise the 50 by pretending it's 60, because they would often bring it forward slightly without explanation. Part of their keeping of their secrecy. That's all I can say.
Right, there was another hand. Oh, this gentleman here.
There's some discussion that we have there's a binary star with our sun, and some people are suggesting that's Sirius. Is that anything that the Dogon would back up or completely dismiss?
I'm glad you mentioned that. There have been very serious suggestions, no pun intended by that, that we do have another sun in our solar system. I mentioned this. I wrote it up in a book of mine called Strange Things. It was suggested by a radio astronomer from West Virginia called Harrison, and he said we can't see it. He gave various reasons, because it's not a bright sun. And so there are also suggestions that there's a dark sun behind the light sun, which is because the sun is made of plasma, that there may be another form of plasma behind the plasma, so we could have a double sun but not even know it. So that's another possibility that's being seriously discussed by plasma physicists at the moment. But the idea that Sirius would be the other one could be in the sense that if the two systems form a cell, that Sirius and the sun would then become, in a sense, binary. So that's actually very perceptive, what you've just said. Thank you for saying it.
Thank you for a most interesting talk. So how benign are these Syrians, these serpent snake? I mean, what did you learn about their intention towards us humans, earthlings, and do we want them to come back? Or, you know, I'm going to go home and think about this. What did you learn?
I think that's a central question. All the evidence is that the visitors had good intentions, got everybody civilized and so forth, but that there are some bad eggs in the basket. And that's why all the myths agree that there are the bad Nommos. So I think that there's frankly a kind of war between good and evil going on in the universe anyway, and that it's reflected at all levels. I mean, we have good people and bad people on this planet, and we could name plenty of both. Well, maybe more of the bad ones than the good ones come to mind, because they tend to be the psychopathic individuals who rise to positions of power due to their obsessive need to control others. And so this is a problem which is universal, and I would believe that it would apply to these aliens, assuming they exist, and that we might be caught in the middle of a dispute between beings considerably more advanced than ourselves. I think that the main ones who are described as culture heroes had good intentions, but I think that they had problems of their own. And so I honestly cannot begin to imagine what recontact would entail.
Solar systems.
6 planets in our region of space. In other words, in our general area, nearby stars, near enough to talk about our region of space. That would be several solar systems. Oh no, they don't identify them. They only identify this solar system and the Sirius solar system. They do talk about other stars, but they don't specifically state that that is where the other planets which they claim are inhabited are. They don't say where they are. In fact, I got the impression from the information written down by the anthropologists that this tradition handed down from the ancestors was passed on to them by the Nommos, who didn't tell them exactly what stars had those planets. They just said that there are 6 that are inhabited, and we come from the 5th, and you're on the 4th, and the men with wings are on the 6th, and the men with horns are on the 3rd. That's all I know.
I was just wondering between the first and the second edition of the Sirius Mystery, is the second edition an expansion, or have you changed any of the basic premises?
I'm very glad you asked that. The second edition of 1998 has 50% additional material added, a product of further research, including, for instance, all of the Greek material about the fishmen and all of the Chinese material. That's all completely new. It wasn't in the first edition at all. I was able to restore some things that the publisher cut out of the first edition, and I corrected a few things, but not very much. But it's mostly a greatly expanded edition.
Thank you. Is there a link between the fish hat that the
Dogons wear in their ceremony, and the fish hat worn by the Pope?
Well, I think possibly there is, yes, because I believe that this shaped hat passed down through the various mystery traditions over the millennia. We've seen it prominent in the Sumerian Babylonian culture, and of course it survives with the Dogon. And I believe that the fish business was intrinsic in the origins of Christianity. The fish was, after all, the symbol in the catacombs, and the fish body is made geometrically from a vesica piscis, the piscis referring to the fish, of course, which is the intersection of the two circles that geometricians here will know. And so I believe that the Pope's hat, which is the same as the hats worn by Church of England bishops as well, probably does have those origins, but none of the Christian bishops or the popes know this, of course. They just don't know where it came from. It's called a mitre.
And could I just ask, do you think there's any link between the story they have of the bright light that appeared and got brighter and then came to a standstill, and the light of the nativity story?
That's a good question. I should say that when the Nommo left, that light got fainter and disappeared, which is interesting, the part of the story that I didn't add. The Star of Bethlehem, I don't know. Take your pick. There's so many possibilities. I don't think that it's anything to do with a visitation, because I don't think there was a visitation at that time, but who knows? I'm not all wise. I can only tell you what I've been able to discover. I'm afraid I haven't got answers for you, just suggestions.
Hi, I just wondered if the Dogon ever explained how and when the Nommo arrived here.
How long ago?
And how and when they came here.
Well, they came down in these ships with fire that made dust and landed in that, but that's how they say they got here. And there are some traditions that they couldn't walk. You find this in many cultures. The Egyptians and the Greeks maintain in one of their very old legends that Zeus, for instance, couldn't walk because his legs were joined together. And the Egyptians have a similar thing. And if you look at the god Ptah, he's always wrapped up so that he doesn't have two legs. He's standing on like one pillar. But it's a concealed sacred mystery, which they're not going to show overtly in their statuary. And so they appear to have gone around in sort of chairs of some kind, and this would apparently be the origin of the symbolism of the throne, and why Sirius A is referred to by the bozo as a seated trouser, because they had to sit and be transported in sort of little vehicles like chairs for their transport, because they couldn't walk, they didn't have legs, and they would. The Babylonians specifically state that at night they went back to the sea and slept in the sea. They didn't sleep on land. Does this help?
Did they ever explain when this happened, how many thousands of years ago this all took place?
Well, no, they just said it was very, very, very long ago with their ancestors in a different land. They don't know how long ago, but if you take all the other information from the other cultures, it can't possibly have been more recently than, say, 3000 BC. It more likely couldn't have been before 3500 BC, but anywhere from that point on it could have been. And it would fit in with the conventional archaeological chronologies that we know, because if it had happened later than that, there'd be some other kind of record of it. It was at the beginning of high civilization on this planet, if it happened at all. I'm inclined to think that it did, but that's just my opinion. You mustn't accept my opinion. You have to make up your own minds about all of this. That's why the book is called The Serious Mystery. What about this girl down here? She seems very eager. Well, that's an extremely good question, too. Why would they go to the trouble? There's no suggestion that they were looking for resources, so I don't know that Sitchin's theories really come into play here at all. That's just his theories. But the thing is that there's got to have been a motive, or more than one. And the Dogon don't suggest them that I know of, but I haven't read all the stuff because it's just very voluminous. And your guess is as good as mine, frankly.
Thank you for illuminating us, and we all here wish you the best for the future and your future work.